In our shorter Part 3 section of Early Republic, we're going to be looking at the odd presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Really quickly, let's move our capital. It had moved from Philadelphia to New York, back to Philadelphia for a minute, and then eventually it's going to land in its modern place of Washington, D.C. Congress understands that the capital needs to be distinct and separate from any state territory. We kind of figure that out during the Pennsylvania Mutiny at the end of the Revolution, when the American Army actually moves in on the capital of Philadelphia. It's important that the capital is not connected to any one state because there's two problems there. One, it could show favoritism to that state. And secondly, it might be too dependent upon that state. So we needed a capital that was not connected to either one. And this became a great debate in Congress because, of course, everybody wants the capital closest to them. Remember, early Americans love local government. They love that they can walk down the street to their mayor or representative's office, knock on their door, and be like, I can't believe you passed that. You're such a freaking dick, Paul. Or whatever. So they want local government. So of course, with the government being so far away, the North, in New York and Philadelphia, the South is trying to pull the capital back down. Well, we eventually get an agreement in terms of the location of the capital, and that is carved out of Maryland. So Maryland gives up territory, and actually originally it was territory that crossed the Potomac. So that red line you're seeing, that's where the capital exists today, but it actually originally crossed the Potomac into Virginia as well. It's just that most of the Capitol buildings were built on the Maryland side of the Potomac, and so that becomes our capital. So the agreement to carve land out of Maryland, right, so this land no longer belongs to Maryland, is the Residency Act of 1790. Washington was fully supportive of this. He signed it. He also was eager to get a capital that's kind of close to his house. He's just kind of constantly trying to get back to Mount Vernon and Martha, Washington. So just on the other side of the Potomac and further out, we see Washington's home at Mount Vernon in Virginia. So he was trying to get kind of the capital closer there as well. So that's why Washington, D.C. is where it is today. Now, an interesting kind of backstory to this, you might note that here in 1790, this is the same year where Congress is debating and passing a lot of Hamilton's financial plans, pictured here to the right. So Hamilton is trying to push through his financial plans of creating a bank and increasing taxes, and which will include the contentious whiskey tax and all this stuff. But what he is willing to compromise on is the placement of the capital. So there is understandings that historians have argued that there were back dealings between specifically Jefferson and Adams, and that they met kind of between people and had like letters sent between them where they kind of agreed Jefferson back off Hamilton's financial plan. Stop trying to destroy Hamilton's financial plan. Allow it to pass through Congress. And in turn, Hamilton will not fight against the capital moving down south, which is where Jefferson wants it. And Jefferson's, of course, from Virginia and Hamilton's from New York, right? So they're both competing on two things: where the capital will be and whether or not to support Hamilton's financial plan. And so this kind of back deal arrangement is struck where Jefferson agrees to, not fully support, but just back off fighting against Hamilton's financial plan. And in return, Hamilton will back off fighting for the capital to stay in or return to New York and allow it to go south to Maryland. So that arrangement helps for the very significant series of laws as part of Hamilton's financial plan to pass, which basically sets us up for this American capitalist system. And it also allows for the Residency Acts, which creates our current capital today. So that's a kind of a famous and long-term significant backdoor deal between politicians. Thomas Jefferson will win the election of 1800. He called it the Revolution of 1800 because, as he said, the era of Federalist rule had come to an end and he would usher in a new era of Democrat-Republican rule based on the concept of liberty for all. What's ironic, as we'll see, about Jefferson's administration, though, is that he actually incorporated a lot of Federalist policy, and through some of the events we'll look at, strengthened not only the powers of the federal government, but the powers of the presidency. However, historians, though they disagree as to his assessment of this revolution, still agree that something revolutionary happened when Jefferson took office in 1800, and I'll share that with you in a moment. But first, with the Federalists under John Adams losing a lot of power, we see the primary race really between two Democrat Republicans. So we had a couple Federalists run and a couple Democratic Republicans won, and the two that received the most votes were the Democrat Aaron Burr from New York on the right, and the sort of founder of the Democrat-Republican Party from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, pictured here to the right. Sorry, I think I said that wrong. Aaron Burr is here on the left and Thomas Jefferson's here on the right. They're both members of the Democratic Republican Party. One's from New York, one's from Virginia. Now, Aaron Burr is a sort of newer member to the Democrat Republican Party, whereas Jefferson, of course, is the founder. And that certainly mattered and affected people's votes to an extent. One's from the North and one's from the South. That also affected people's votes. But what ended up happening was Jefferson and Burr received the same number of electoral votes. What the Constitution says is that each elector gets 2 votes, right? They cast their first vote for their favorite pick, this another vote for maybe their second favorite pick. Whoever gets the most number of votes becomes president. Whoever gets the second most becomes vice president. Well, here our top 2 contenders received the same number of electoral votes. So it was unclear what would happen. This goes to the House. According to the Constitution, if it is unclear who the Electoral College has chosen, then the vote for the presidency goes to the House. The vote for the vice presidency would go to the Senate. But here we have a race for who's first. The House chooses not as individuals, but by state. So this means all the delegates of Virginia would cast a vote, and all the delegates of Maryland would cast a vote, and so forth and so on. Now, it would appear, because there are numerically more states in the North and the South, that Burr would likely win this election. However, with no Federalist in the ring anymore, Federalist states were unsure how to cast their vote. And they looked, in part, famously, toward the founder of the Federalist Party, Alexander Hamilton, who's semi-retired. Hamilton was not keen on either. He, of course, has a long history with Jefferson within Washington's cabinet, just kind of the two of them totally opposed to one another, hating each other. So everybody expected that Hamilton would come out and endorse Burr, who was also from New York. But surprisingly, Hamilton actually hated Burr even more. Although he disagreed with a lot of the values that and ideas and policies that Jefferson had, Hamilton viewed Burr as something worse. He was just a political climber. He was just, running for the presidency because it's the highest you can go in that career. So even though he disagreed a lot with Jefferson, he at least felt that Jefferson was genuine, whereas Aaron Burr was an opportunist. So surprising everyone, Hamilton comes out and formally endorses Jefferson. This gets just enough support, especially there in the Mid-Atlantic states, to give Jefferson the presidency, and Aaron Burr will become vice president. Well, since this election was so weird, and it's not the first time we've had questions about the Electoral College, just a few years later in 1804, Congress and the states ratify the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment says that the Electoral College, so electoral votes, must be done separately. So rather than of the 2 votes you have as an elector, you don't vote one for your favorite and one for your second favorite. Rather, instead, you vote one for the president and one for the vice president. That way, they're sort of two separate positions, and we can ensure we don't have to deal with this anymore. Now, it changes state by state because obviously today, when you go vote, especially here in California, you see kind of the package deal, right? If you want Trump, you're going to get Pence, right? If you want, Obama, you're going to get Biden, and so forth. And that speed really kind of comes out of Abraham Lincoln's administration. He's sort of the first president to formally begin the idea of a running mate. So we'll talk about that more later. But right now, they're kind of separate entities. Now, the Revolution of 1800, which historians cite, not what Jefferson necessarily argued it to be, is the passing of power peacefully in this country. If you look across world history, the passing of power does not always come very peacefully. The person who held power does not always step down. And to be pushed out of power, you might see a civil war where thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of people die. Here in this country, as solidified under the Constitution, when a new president is elected, the last president must step down peacefully. And the first time that happened, where power passed from one political rival to the next, was when power passed from the Federalist John Adams to the Democrat Republican Thomas Jefferson. It wasn't such a big deal for Washington to pass power to Adams. They played on the same team. They were part of the same party, the Federalists. But to pass power to your political rival demonstrates something very wonderful in this country, this very long, proud tradition, which also includes a tradition of a concession or a concession speech, that the loser of a race, either you lost the race or you were president and you give a farewell speech. Either way, a concession speech or a farewell speech, the idea that I am acknowledging that a peaceful transition of power is the best thing for this country, even if I don't like the new person coming in, I will make this speech, I will accept it, and I will step down. That is another very long, proud thing. So like when, Trump was elected, obviously, Democrats did not like this at all, and yet Obama doesn't try to stay another 4 years, right, upending the 22nd Amendment. He gives a farewell speech. Clinton didn't try to fight it in the courts or start a civil war. She gives her concession speech. Same thing happened, when you look with the Democrats sort of stepping in. When Obama took over, George W. Bush did not fight his way for a third term. He stepped down. And when McCain lost that pretty intense race against Obama, he gives, that actually very emotional concession speech. So this is the beginning of a very nice thing in this country, because we do, talk about all of the terrible things that have happened in our past. It's nice to note these good things as well. So we are going to see other political parties. We're going to eventually, by the end of our semester here, see the second and third party systems. But in terms of the first party system, the battle between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, this is a little spoiler alert, the Federalists will lose. That's probably how come some of you haven't heard of them. Or certainly at least none of you have ever voted for a Federalist, because that party no longer exists. So right now we're listing out reasons as to why the Federalists will fall. And for a short period of time, the Democrat Republicans will take over. But even they will faction, and they'll create the second party system, because again, partisan politics is a quite natural and organic movement. So one thing that leads to the end of the Federalists are the unpopularity of John Adams. John Adams is actually the only true Federalist president we have in United States history, and he becomes enormously unpopular. He only serves one term. He is not reelected. Another thing that brings down the Federalist Party is the death of Hamilton. So Hamilton was really the founder of the Federalist Party because of his economic plan that he proposed there in 1790. And he is also a very sort of contentious rival with Aaron Burr, who is now the vice president of Thomas Jefferson. Because Thomas Jefferson won the vote in the House, Aaron Burr automatically became Jefferson's vice president. So Aaron Burr and Hamilton are both from New York, and Hamilton, the Federalist, and Aaron Burr, the Democratic Republican, agreed on very, very little. They disagreed a lot. And in fact, they hated one another. And it was really Aaron Burr who just despises Hamilton, right? This again demonstrates how much our founding fathers really believed that one party would die out, in some cases literally. So because of this political contention between the two, and there's a little history there, Aaron Burr famously challenges Hamilton to a duel. Now, typically in a duel at this time, because outright murder is illegal, right? If you kill someone, you go to jail. Typically in a duel, the purpose is not necessarily to murder them, but to sort of injure them. Well, Aaron Burr challenges Hamilton. Hamilton begrudgingly decides to accept this challenge. Supposedly, Hamilton, who was possibly opposed to violence and opposed to dueling, some historians have suggested purposefully missed Aaron Burr, while Aaron Burr did not intend to miss and instead shot straight for Hamilton, fatally wounding him. So Hamilton passes away in 1804 because of this duel. And when he dies, not only by now is John Adams had been a very unpopular president, but now really the founder of the Federalist Party has passed away as well. The other famous Federalist was George Washington, and he passed away 5 years before, or just less than 5 years before this. So our major leading Federalists are either discounted or dead by the time we get into the first years of the 19th century. So Jefferson is president, and again, much like Adams, I'll really just mention a couple things so that we can kind of keep moving along. Jefferson, if we were to sort of describe his policies as president, it's in two simple words: limited spending. And so again, it's sort of unclear whether we define him as a modern day Democrat or a modern day Republican, because he was a little bit of both, right? So our modern day Democratic and Republicans don't exist yet. So you just have to kind of, again, let that go. But Jefferson believed in limited government, in hands-off government. And so in that way, he would be kind of like a modern day, I guess, Republican. To limit spending, he decides to abolish all internal taxes, which is a pretty intense thing to do, because this means he's going to dramatically lower revenue for the United States, right? There should be no internal taxes whatsoever. Also, to pay for this, right, because obviously the American government's going to have less money coming in, to be able to afford this, he cuts the military. So the military, which was already almost non-existent, is cut in half. And Jefferson makes the argument that the states should be able to rely on their state militia, that they should not have to rely on the federal military. However, despite this limited spending, which might seem sort of foolish at a time where we're just recovering from our economic recession, Jefferson is actually credited by historians for helping to pay off a majority of the American Revolutionary debt. Now, that is partly because of the policies of the previous presidents. This is a problem we sort of see as presidents, incoming presidents sort of take credit for good things that are happening, when in fact they're happening, they're just because of past policies from past presidents. But Jefferson does help to dramatically lower the debt from our war. And the question becomes, how is that possible? If he limited our revenue, if he lowered taxes and cut our military, how could he possibly have paid off debt if less money is coming in? And he does this by selling land. So Jefferson, again, as I kind of mentioned when we talked about political participation, Jefferson is looking at these Western territories, and specifically in what's known as the Northwestern region, and these states, what these will be states pictured here to the right. And he argues that the land in westward is being sold for too high. He says the only people that are going to move out west are poor people, right? Rich people already have their awesome house by the coast. It's the poor who are constantly being pushed westward. The poor cannot buy expensive land, which means nobody's really buying this land. And so Jefferson says we need to dramatically reduce the price of land westward. And so Congress does that. They sell it for very, very cheap prices. In some cases, nearly free. And we'll talk about that more later. And this allows the poor to start moving out westward. It allows them to get property, which gives them now the right to vote. And of course, they're going to vote Democratic, Republican. And so that helps Jefferson's party. But because so many people are buying this land, it does lead to a massive increase in revenue for the federal government, right? Like if you had one piece of land and you were selling it for $1 million, no single person can buy that plot of land for $1 million. But if you cut up the land and divide each part of it for $1 and 1 million people come out and buy it, well, now you have $1 million, whereas before you didn't. So it was just a smarter way to sell land, and it does help to pay off a huge chunk of our Revolutionary War debt, which will be almost gone by the time we get into the 1820s. Thomas Jefferson's ability to pay off the Revolutionary debt due to the land sales boom in the Northwest Territory, which you see here, is very much tied to his administration's Native American policy. The problem was, as has been the problem and will continue to be the problem, is that Native Americans claim that these are their lands by right, their ancestral right, and just because America's coming doesn't mean they should give up those lands. Well, the Jefferson administration kind of found a loophole. They went out and met with chiefs and tribes and made the argument that if you legally held this land, it was viewed as legally yours because you purchased it, then the federal government can't touch it, right? Otherwise, we don't have proof that it's legally your land other than your claim, and so people are going to come out and take it. So the only way to permanently hold on to it is to purchase it, right? From this new Northwest Territory Ordinance, which was selling land pretty cheap. However, the problem is that natives were being forced to purchase this land with currency and within an economic forum that didn't exist to Native Americans, right? It only existed sort of with Western countries, you know, the idea of buying something on credit or paying with paper notes, which backs up some sort of specie. The Native Americans didn't have this. So they signed these treaties with the federal government saying, yeah, we're going to purchase these lands, but without the actual cash flow to pay for it, they were unable to essentially pay the mortgage on their home. Now, Jefferson had legal authority to remove natives from their land. It's the same as the bank removing you from your house should you fail to pay the mortgage. So Jefferson is able to sleep at night because he feels like he's doing a good thing. He's giving natives the opportunity to purchase their land outright so that it's not going to be an issue again. He also, in his administration, encouraged Native Americans toward gradual civilization to become more respectable. Again, he slept at night just fine at this time because assimilation, rather than acceptance of differences, was seen as kind of the kinder, nicer thing to do rather than kill them all. This still fits with what eventually will be the Office of Interior's motto, which was to kill the Indian, save the man, civilize him into Western society with Christianity, with Western clothing, with the English language, and different kinds of housing, and all that kind of stuff. So this was part of Washington's plan to get the natives to rightfully own their land while also civilizing them, thus ending conflict out west. But again, what it actually did was trap natives into debt, right? They did not have money, cash up front to purchase this land. So they would sign treaties purchasing it from the federal government on credit. When they're unable to pay off that credit, they're then legally forced off of the land, and that land was then sold off cheaply to poor white families that began to move out west. And everyone again pretty much slept well at night, partly because Jefferson felt like his administration had adopted a kinder, more liberal, progressive way to deal with the natives. A lot of the population are still reminiscent of native alliances with the British and the ambushes on American soldiers during the Revolution. So there's this still concern that they're all sort of enemies out there laying in waiting. So the point is that whether presidents sought in what was in their eyes a kinder way to deal with the natives, or whether they overtly accepted a harsher, more violent way to deal with the natives, we still see the same conclusions in all these administrations regarding Native Americans, which is their being pushed westward, as well as denying of their rights to practice sort of their culture and ancestral habits. One of the more significant things that happens during Thomas Jefferson's 8 years as president is the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, which you can see here in yellow. The territory in both brown, well, to the west and south, and in yellow are owned by the Spanish. Everything west of the Mississippi River, if we recall, in the Treaty of Paris that ended the Peace of Paris that ended the American Revolution, everything west of the Mississippi belongs to Spain. Everything east of the Mississippi, with the exception of Florida, belongs to the U.S., with the British Canadian territories to the north. So Spain is interested in selling this territory. Spain has become kind of the new Roman Empire. They're just spread a little too thin. And they end up giving this territory to the French under Napoleon. So Napoleon has aims to reclaim a French empire in the Americas. And he already has some territories in the Caribbean, but he wants to reclaim some of the territories that were lost after the French and Indian War. Now, on the other side of the pond, the president of the U.S., Thomas Jefferson, is very happy to acquire some of this territory, but he is very bummed out that the Spanish have sold it to the French. He is annoyed by having a Spanish neighbor, but the Spanish are a relatively weak power compared to the French. And if the French become his new neighbor, the French could consolidate control over the Mississippi and over the Gulf, which would prevent American trade. So Jefferson decides to send James Monroe to go and join Robert Livingston, who was already a American diplomat in Paris, and for the two of them to negotiate with the French the purchase just of New Orleans and West Florida. New Orleans will eventually become a significant export city for us, as well as Western Florida, which you can see at this particular time is not really Western Florida anymore, but what had been the entire panhandle of Florida extended to New Orleans. So we wanted to purchase both of those. And Monroe and Livingston were actually given permission by Congress to spend $2 million, but they were also allowed to potentially spend as much as $10 million. And again, just for New Orleans and Western Florida, or the panhandle of Florida. Well, Napoleon, during this process, is in a pretty precarious situation. We are transitioning from the French Revolutionary Wars to the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon himself will be transitioning from consul to emperor of France. He is attempting to finance these very expensive wars in Europe against the British and their allies before he can consolidate a empire across the Atlantic Ocean. He needs to consolidate his empire in Europe itself. So he's trying to finance that very expensive bloody war. At the same time, a slave revolt breaks out in Haiti, right, in the Western Hemisphere. And though eventually this slave revolt against the French colonists or the colonial empire is eventually successful, its leader is executed and killed, but the slave revolt is ultimately successful. And in 1803, Haiti achieves its independence from France. It also, because it is headed by mostly black Haitians, Haiti is the first black government we see in the Western Hemisphere, which is kind of a separate, topic in terms of slavery. The United States was very nervous about the Haitian slave revolt and its success, fearing that it could lead to some kind of domino effect of, slave revolts taking over the Western Hemisphere, which could eventually inspire slave revolts in the U.S. So the U.S. was not actually favorable to the slave revolt. However, the slave revolt does assist the United States in an indirect way, because now Napoleon has troops that get a little bogged down in Haiti too, and they're not able to move up to New Orleans and take hold of that territory that had been purchased. So the combination of the slave revolt and him attempting to finance this great war in Europe leads Napoleon to actually offer the Americans, Monroe and Livingston, purchase of the entire territory. Now, originally he offered $22 million, but Monroe and Livingston had negotiated it down to $15 million. So that would be $15 million for an area that's about 830,000 miles, which, by today's standards is just wonderful. It's a very, very good deal for us. So it's a bargain. The problem is that even at $15 million, it's way more than Monroe and Livingston were supposed to spend. So when word gets back to Jefferson kind of goes through this sort of soul-searching moment, which we can see through his letters. We want to remember that Thomas Jefferson is a Democrat-Republican, and Democratic Republicans read the Constitution very narrowly. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say that presidents can purchase foreign lands. And so just like it said nowhere in the Constitution can we create a bank, if we buy this territory, even though it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, that would be abusive or unconstitutional. So based on his Democrat-Republican beliefs, he cannot sign this treaty. The acting for the United States. The problem is, though, if he does sign this treaty and acquires all this new land, he'll achieve one of his other great aims for the U.S., which is self-reliance. That with this Western expansion, poor Americans will be able to expand west, become property owners, and we'll all be we'll have an economy based on, what he called Yemen farmers or private landowners that are able to depend on themselves. We're not dependent on international trade. We're not dependent on big industrialization. And the only way to achieve this Yemen economy is expansion west and the acquisition of more territory. So it's kind of a catch-22, I guess. If he signs the Louisiana Purchase, he will be abusing the Constitution by expanding his powers of the presidency and taking a wide reading of the Constitution, which he did not support. But if he does sign it, he achieves his potential dream of a Yemen farmer American economy. So there is a suggestion to create an amendment, but that would allow the government to purchase foreign lands, but an amendment would take way too long. And this whole Louisiana Purchase was actually much more dramatic than I'm making it. It was Napoleon was very much on the cusp of attempting to reclaim this land, of pulling the deal. He might have gotten bored. He might have sold it to somebody else. He might have actually started to become successful in Europe, which means he could hold on to the territory. So there's not enough time to pass an amendment, and so Jefferson just decides to sign the treaty, thus expanding his powers of the presidency and taking a wide view of the Constitution. He takes a very ambiguous reading of the Constitution to legitimize his signing of the Louisiana Purchase. The Constitution does say that the federal government controls territories that are not yet states, and so Jefferson argued that that meant the federal government could also purchase new territories, which is clearly kind of a giant leap in terms of our reading and interpretation of the Constitution. So Jefferson's kind of this great irony here. We would place him in a basket of presidents that are responsible for expanding the powers of the presidency. Andrew Jackson's in that basket. Franklin Roosevelt's in that basket. Every single president since Franklin Roosevelt's in that basket. Abraham Lincoln's in that basket, but one of the first presidents in that basket is Thomas Jefferson, which again is so ironic because he hates being in that basket because he believes the powers of the presidency should be very small, but he actually greatly expanded them here. I do want to point out, though, that this is eventually sent through by legal constitutional means. In October 1803, this does go to the Senate. According to the Constitution, the Senate, by a 2/3 majority, has to confirm all foreign treaties, and they do that in October 1803. Another great irony of the Louisiana Purchase is the 7 senators that voted against the Louisiana Purchase were all Federalists, and they had different reasons for opposing the Louisiana Purchase, but a lot of it was political. They were concerned that if people moved west, they're not going to have a strong loyalty to the federal government. They were also concerned, and they charged Jefferson with reading the Constitution too widely and taking on too great of powers that were not explicitly listed in the Constitution, which again is ironic because the Federalists actually take a wide lens of the Constitution. So Louisiana Purchase is a nice kind of early example that we see even today, where sometimes politicians, despite their supposed hardline policies, are actually willing to sway in the wind a little bit depending on the situation that they're presented. This is also indirectly upheld a couple decades later in an 1823 Supreme Court ruling where Chief Justice John Marshall argued that the federal government does indeed have rights to acquire foreign territory via conquest or treaty. So that indirectly supports the Louisiana Purchase, which had come 20 years early. It also opens the door for the United States to acquire more territory as we move forward in this century. In an effort to continue to understand how the federal government strengthens and becomes even more powerful, we're going to now turn to the Supreme Court. Just like presidents like Thomas Jefferson, ironically, helped to increase the powers of the presidency, the Marshall Court helped to increase the powers of the Supreme Court. So in Supreme Court history, we divide that history up by whoever was Chief Justice at the time. So the Marshall Court is headed by Chief Justice John Marshall, pictured here. Other famous Chief Justices have been the Taney Court, which gives us the Dred Scott decision, as we'll see later. There was the Warren Court, which participated in Supreme Court decisions that upheld a number of civil rights legislature, and so they're sort of more important as you move into the 20th century. We're currently living under the Roberts Court with Chief Justice Roberts heading the Supreme Court today. So the Marshall Court is important to us. It is the first long-standing, or John Marshall becomes the first long-standing Chief Justice. Prior to him, we had 2 other Chief Justices that were shorter lived, and the most important decision to come to us through the Supreme Court prior to the Marshall Court was probably Grisham versus Georgia, which leads to the 11th Amendment. So the Marshall Court will usher in a series of new Supreme Court decisions which focus on strengthening the powers of the federal government, with the Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution and allowing the federal government to have more power. It's important to understand who John Marshall is. Remember, we've talked about him briefly before. He served in the American Revolution and he was present at Valley Forge, as was Alexander Hamilton, who goes on to create the Federalist Party, as was George Washington, who goes on to support Federalist policy. So the three of them at Valley Forge were able to see firsthand how decentralization and chaos amongst competing voices can lead to tragedy. It was really Valley Forge, and the men who starved and died there didn't die because there was no food available at all. It's because there was mismanagement in getting that food to them. So their experiences of the revolution teach them that sometimes a central government is important when it comes to maintaining order. And so this takes us into probably the most important decision ever passed by the Supreme Court. And that decision was Marbury versus Madison. Here's a background to this very significant Supreme Court decision. We remember that John Adams lost the election of 1800, and he lost that election to his political rival, the Democrat-Republican Thomas Jefferson. And John Adams is really the only true Federalist to be in the presidency. So when he leaves the White House, he's going to leave it to a political rival. So knowing that it's unlikely that he's going to win re-election, he has Congress pass a new Judiciary Act. This eventually becomes known as the Judiciary Act of 1801. And this act allowed for Congress to create a series of new courts, which is their constitutional right. Again, the Constitution allows for Congress to create new courts at any given time. So a bunch of new courts are created. Now we need judges to sit on those courts, and that goes back to the president. So John Adams, in the last hours of his presidencies, signs or appoints more than 50 new judges. These are known as the midnight judges because they were appointed by Madison and they were approved by the Senate in the last hours of John Adams' presidency. Now, the goal of the midnight judges and what John Adams is trying to do here is to appoint as many Federalist judges as he can, so that even though he's going to leave office, he'll leave in his place a court system that supports Federalist ideals. And this is not an uncommon thing. We'll see throughout American history what's known as court stacking or court packing. And this is where presidents, of course, attempt to appoint people who, even though judges are supposed to be apolitical, and that's why we don't see judges calling themselves Republicans or Democrats, judges do tend to rule more conservatively or they do tend to rule more liberally. So if you are a liberal president and there's an opportunity to appoint a judge, you're going to appoint a liberal judge or a judge who has a history of liberal rulings. Same thing, vice versa if you are a conservative president. This was seen really famously under FDR's presidency. Because he was president for so long, his presidency outlasted a lot of Supreme Court justices. So by the end of FDR's term or presidency, the Supreme Court, which actually leads us into the Warren Court, will support a lot of his New Deal legislation. We see this today too. This is true of Democrats and it's true of Republicans, that presidents will attempt to appoint judges who are more likely to fulfill the goals of that political party. Because presidents come and go, senators and representatives come and go, but judges serve for life. And so if you can pack the court with however many judges that are favorable to your ideals, that's how you create a more lasting legacy. So that was the goal of these famous midnight judges. Of course, these midnight judges piss off Jefferson. And he can see that the Adams administration is trying to destroy him before he even takes office. Now, the way this works is even after the president appoints you and even after you're confirmed by the Senate, you have to receive your commission. And it's not until you receive this piece of paper, which basically says, congratulations, you're a judge. It's not until you receive that commission that you can officially take your seat as a judge. And the job it is to give judges the commission is the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson will be Madison, who we've talked about a lot before. Madison is the new Secretary of State, and it's his job to deliver those commissions to those new more than 50 judges that had been appointed as part of the Midnight Judges. Well, Jefferson orders his Secretary of State Madison, do not deliver the commissions. Don't give those people, those judges, those pieces of paper, because I don't want them to take their seats. So Madison complies. He does not deliver the commissions. One of those would-be judges was a guy who had been appointed within Washington, D.C., William Marbury. That's why the case is called Marbury versus Madison. Marbury's sitting around his mailbox being like, where the hell is Madison? Why hasn't he delivered my commission? And he's pissed, right? He's like, I'm supposed to be a justice. I was confirmed by the Senate and appointed by the last president. Where's my commission? And he argues that Madison is not fulfilling his job. He's not fulfilling his duty. So Marbury appeals directly to the Supreme Court. Rather than go to kind of a more local court or even a federal court within D.C., he goes directly to the top of the triangle, directly to the Supreme Court. And the reason he appeals directly to the Supreme Court is for two reasons. One, because of a legal ideal known as right of mandamus or rights of mandamus, the courts have the right to compel inferior government officials to do their job. So in this case, the Supreme Court, according to Marbury, has the right to force Madison to deliver the commission to Marbury. In addition, Marbury goes directly to the Supreme Court because of the Judiciary Act of 1789. So this was another act by Congress that directs the Supreme Court. And in it, it said a bunch of things which we've covered before, but one of the things covered in the Judiciary Act says that the Supreme Court has sole jurisdiction to hear cases where there is a case being brought against the federal government. Right? So if you as an individual are bringing a case against the federal government, it goes immediately to the Supreme Court. That's what the Judiciary Act said. So that's why Marbury goes to the Supreme Court. He thinks the Supreme Court should use their right of mandamus to compel Madison to give him the commission. He also thinks he has to go directly to the Supreme Court because the Judiciary Act gave the Supreme Court that jurisdiction. So what did the Marshall Court decide? Actually, the Marshall Court disagreed with Marbury in the end. At first they say, yeah, Madison and Jefferson, what they're doing is illegal. By withholding the commission of Marbury, that is illegal. He's already been confirmed by the Senate. You know, all he needs is this piece of paper, and what Madison and Jefferson are doing is wrong. Marbury is entitled to take his seat. However, even though that might be true, we still have to rule against Marbury. And the reason was they argued the Supreme Court did not have a right to hear the case because their interpretation of the Constitution, it was inconsistent with that Judiciary Act of 1789. So we remember Article 3 of the Constitution talks about the court system, right? And specifically the Supreme Courts and the jurisdiction of the Supreme Courts. But it's a very short article and it's widely open for interpretation because it's so short and so brief. And the Marshall Court, the Chief Justice in this case, interprets the third article of the Constitution to a limited amount of immediate jurisdiction or sole jurisdiction, or what's called original jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction is where a case would immediately have to go to the Supreme Court. They argued that Article 3 of the Constitution does not give the Supreme Court original jurisdiction over any case brought to the federal government. Therefore, Marbury appealing directly to the Supreme Court decision was not the appropriate way to go. Thus, they cannot hear the case. Thus, they had to disagree with Marbury. So even though in policy and in practice they disagreed with Madison, they argued simply that Marbury went about the case in a weird way. Now that whole case is kind of confusing, admittedly, but the reason why the Marbury versus Madison decision is so important to us is because it establishes the Supreme Court right to judicial review. Judicial review, in this case, is a little bit different than what we looked at before, where courts have the right to review cases from inferior courts, right? So the Supreme Court can review all the federal courts can review all state courts can review all local courts, and so forth and so on, right? There's that hierarchy in the court system. Well, here we have another version of judicial review. Judicial review says that the Supreme Court, or that the courts really in general, have the right to interpret the Constitution. And because they have the right to interpret the Constitution, they can determine the acts of presidents and acts of Congress to be either constitutional or unconstitutional. So this makes the Supreme Court enormously powerful. In fact, it's enshrined there in the walls of the Supreme Court building today in Washington, D.C. That it is the duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. So this is how we get to the idea of the three branches of government. Congress makes law, the executive branch enforces law, and the judiciary branch interprets the law. They get to determine if laws passed by the legislative branch are constitutional. If they determine that those laws are not constitutional, those laws are null and void. They also have the right to look at executive actions, and if they determine that the executive action is unconstitutional, they are basically ruling that action to be null and void. So this, in a way, almost makes the Supreme Court, in certain cases, more powerful than the president, more powerful than Congress, because they get the last say, because they get to determine the Constitution. Because what happened here in Marbury versus Madison is Marshall is arguing that the Constitution is inconsistent with the Judiciary Act of 1789, or at least that one section of the Judiciary Act which gave the Supreme Court original jurisdiction. Marshall is saying Congress can't create this act because it is contradictory to my interpretation of the Constitution. Thus, that section of the Judiciary Act is null and void. Thus, Marbury's case cannot be heard at the Supreme Court. So again, I appreciate the case itself might be a little confusing, but what's important to pull from this is that Marbury versus Madison gives the Supreme Court the right to interpret the Constitution, thus giving them the power to affirm or deny all congressional acts and to affirm or deny all executive actions. There are many other significant decisions that come out of the Marshall Court, but we'll just look at two more really famous ones that help to further establish the powers of the federal government, specifically over the states. So we have McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819 and Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. Now these both occur after Jefferson's administration, whereas that earlier one, Marbury versus Madison, occurred during Jefferson's administration. But just to stay on the topic of the Marshall Court, we'll look at these two cases which occur later. So first, McCulloch versus Maryland. What happened here was a few years earlier in 1816, the United States Congress reapproved the Bank of the U.S. Remember, the bank is first chartered, becoming the first bank of the U.S. as part of Hamilton's financial plan, which helped to create our first party system. Well, now it's 1816, and the charter, or essentially the time limit, on that bank has come to an end. And now Congress has to reassess, do we like the bank? If so, we need to have a second charter, which means continue the bank. If no, then we will not have a recharter and the bank dies. Well, in 1816, by this time, we have many people in Congress who are supporting the growth of the federal government for reasons we'll look at in the next part of this series. We have a new group that are called the New Nationalists that gain a lot more power. And they support the growth of the federal government, which means they're now okay with the idea of having a federal bank. So in 1816, we have the second charter Bank of the U.S. Now, the state of Maryland is one of many states that doesn't really like the bank. And the state of Maryland decides to put a tax on the bank itself, right? Because there was a branch of this federal bank within the state of Maryland. And Maryland argued, since this federal bank is inside my borders, I have the right to tax it just like I do nearly anything else in my state, right? Because of these state sovereignty issues. So Maryland taxes the Bank of the United States. Well, McCulloch was the head clerk at the bank, and he refuses to pay the tax. So we have McCulloch, who represents the Bank of the U.S. against the state of Maryland. This goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court first has to decide, well, is the Bank of the United States even constitutional? Are we allowed to have a bank? Because if the bank itself is unconstitutional, then this ends the case right there and Maryland wins. You know, we shouldn't even have a bank. But the Marshall Court argued that it is perfectly constitutional for Congress to create a Bank of the United States. And he cites the necessary and proper cause, or the elastic clause, that Congress needs some flexibility to create laws which allow it to do its job. And, you know, a bank appears to be necessary in this particular case, thus the Bank of the United States is constitutional. So fine, we've checked that box. The bank is okay. Now let's talk about, do states have the right to tax a federal bank? And the Marshall Court argued no. They argued that states are inferior to the federal government, that states have no control over the federal government, thus the states cannot tax the federal government, or in this case, a federal bank. And Marshall, in his majority decision, famously writes, because the power to tax is the power to destroy. If the state can tax the federal government, that gives the states the potential ability to destroy the federal government. And that's not how the U.S. Constitution is supposed to work. The federal government is supreme to the state government. So McCulloch v. Maryland first again makes the federal bank constitutional, and that will become important to us as we eventually get into modern U.S. history and we see the creation of the Federal Reserve. And then also it clarifies essentially the supremacy clause, that Congress is in fact, and in the federal government as a whole, is superior to the states. Then we have Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. And basically what we have here is a debate between two steamship companies. One of them is running ships from New York to New Jersey, thus interstate waters, waters that affect more than one state. And that would be Gibbons. So Gibbons had a steamboat that was moving between New York and New Jersey. Ogden was another steamboat company that essentially had a monopoly to run steamboats within New York waters. So what happens is when Gibbons takes their ship into New York waters, Ogden argued, hey, get your freaking ship out of here. I run New York waters. You can't move your boat through New York waters. Only Ogden ships can. And Gibbons argues, well, wait a minute. I'm not moving just within New York waters. I'm moving between New York and New Jersey waters, making this an interstate issue, which means it belongs to the federal government. And originally, the state of New York disagreed with Gibbons. They said, no, Ogden has full control over New York waters. Thus, anybody moving in to New York waters is violating their right to, navigate New York waters. So this is then appealed up to the Supreme Court. And in this case, the Marshall Court agrees with Gibbons, and they flex on the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So the Commerce Clause of the Constitution gives the federal government the right to control trade between states. They can't control trade within a state, right? So if you're trading goods from Los Angeles to San Francisco, that's a California issue. But if you're trading goods from San Francisco to Phoenix, Arizona, now that's a federal issue because you've crossed a state line. So they expand the Commerce Clause to argue that it includes water or sea navigation as well. And this was important at the time because we're still moving westward, and there were a lot of debates as to eventually the growth of the railways in the 1830s and 40s. There were a lot of debates about who controls rivers and waterways, because these rivers, of course, run through multiple states. Well, the answer, according to Gibbons and Ogden, is it belongs to the federal government. If a river, if a freeway, if a railway is going to move through multiple states, it belongs to the federal government, or the federal government gets to make all rulings in that case. It does not belong to a singular state. So Ogden was wrong to argue that Gibbons cannot go into New York waters because that ship is moving between states, thus can only be inhibited by the federal government. So again, this decision becomes more important and will be cited later on in later Supreme Court decisions as we start to see the expansion of the railway. When we get into the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era of the late 19th and early 20th century, we start to see the federal government regulating railways upon this argument that if you move through multiple states, the federal government has a right to regulate you. In our next section, we say farewell to President Jefferson, who served his 2 terms, followed Washington's precedent, and stepped down. And we'll introduce our last 2 presidents for this series. To the left, we have someone you may recognize, President Madison, and to the left, President Monroe. There we will see new foreign policy and changes for the federal government on a global scale. We'll also begin to introduce more seeds that will plant to take us closer to a civil war.